You're watching West Hartford Community Television.
You're watching West Hartford Community Television.
You're watching West Hartford Community Television.
For the community, by the community.
Right, because so many people live so far from centers.
I am here to introduce to you a production by the League of Women Voters of Connecticut in cooperation with West Hartford Public Access Television. This program is to celebrate the 90th anniversary of the establishment of the League of Women Voters. The League's work through the past century has proven time and time again that a nonpartisan civic organization can successfully provide the education and the experience needed by the public to make democracy successful. The exhibit depicts a timeline of women's involvement in government from the mid-1800s to the present day. It presents the historical national suffrage struggle and the social, religious, and civic conditions of women of that era. And it emphasizes Connecticut women, especially as part of the Connecticut League. We invite those of you who are not members to join our ranks and to help us be the voice for citizens in freedom for change. I would like now to introduce you to the lead researcher and planner for this project, Elisa McCarthy.
Thanks, Carole. This was such a fun project. There was so much wonderful research available, so many really interesting stories, so many wonderful characters to read about and see pictures of. And we also have a lot of places to thank for their help along the way. Particularly, you should be aware that 13 of our pieces are from the Women's Hall of Fame, and they were just fabulous in their help to us.
The national suffrage movement was a group of women and men, many of whom learned their power techniques in the early 1800s in the abolitionist movement. Our timeline starts with the happy meeting of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You had the first National Women's Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts, but before that, in Seneca Falls, Mrs. Stanton had moved to from Boston. Her husband thought he could get a better job as a lawyer. They decided to fight for the right to vote because that's where the power would be. But they didn't know what they were up against. And it relatively stayed a small movement for a very long time. One of the really interesting conventions was the one at which Sojourner Truth spoke. She was there for 4 days, and only on the very last day did she speak. But she so electrified the audience that they asked her back again to speak later in that day. Evidently, she was a pretty unusual woman. She was around 6 feet tall and had a very commanding voice. And even though the person who recorded her speech did it in sort of dialect, evidently she wasn't really that much speaking in dialect because everybody else totally understood her. Her big statement was, "I must sojourn to the ballot just one time in my life." Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the rather fluffy, lovely mother of 7. Susan B. Anthony, the austere, very underdressed. In 1873, she was tried for illegally voting. Actually, it wasn't just she and a number of women all illegally voted. Of course it was illegal, they weren't allowed to vote. They went and cast their ballot, and the people who were running it let them do it, and then they were arrested afterwards for illegally voting. She ended up paying a $100 fine. They wanted her to do jail time, and then they backed off on that. In Quaker services or meetings, they did speak to crowds. Other women in this time period did not speak publicly. One of the things that started was a newspaper called The Revolution. That was a really important one because so many people lived so far from centers of population that they had no way to find out what was going on. In 1878, the Supreme Court says that states can restrict women from the practice of any profession in order to uphold the law of the Creator. Now that was one of the big arguments, that God had a place for women and it was somewhere out of Adam's rib and that's it. And it's one of the really strong activities that they were up against. That meant that many of the churches were split on it, but many of the churches said that women did not have rights, were completely at their husband's command, and shouldn't hold jobs like law, and you can imagine what that would do. One of the things they were not allowed to do was serve on juries. Now, that leads one to a question. How can you have a jury of your peers if there's no women on the jury? The colors that the suffragists used in their parades, but also in publications even, were G for green, W for white, and V for violet. But our art director, alias Pat George, also discovered that a lot of them, including some in Connecticut, also used yellow. So what we've got as our background colors will be those colors. And this was started way back in 1870. This is 1871. It's like many of the newspapers of the day, a little bit hard to follow. First of all, they had to have really good eyes to read that print. And secondly, it would be poetry, short stories, right there, you know, jokes, recipes, sometimes on the front page, not on this one. Mr. Blackwell's Fallacy, which is a short story. The Woman's Advocate, which, you know, advertising what they're doing. She is Miss Susan Sharptongue, and she's the man tamer. That is as racy as you get in 71. Her ankles are showing. Good God. Shocking. Yes, very shocking. And she's the man tamer. That's one of the ongoing arguments, that this was a way to reduce men's power and to reduce men in women's view and to just take over. So here you've got the ongoing joke, and this goes through for about 50 years, the joke of the woman running the household and the husband holding the baby and having to take care of him. Women now manage most of the public libraries in Massachusetts. Now, if you lived way out in Wyoming, you would have no idea that women were that active, or that they were essentially getting a salary for work for a governmental organization. And that got to be important. It's also important because one of the first things that women were allowed to vote on was libraries. Money spent on libraries, who would run the libraries, public libraries, and so forth. I guess they figured if mom is going to be around raising the kids and teaching them to read and sending them to school, they might as well get involved in that. So even in Connecticut, and we were not in the front line of giving votes on anything, women here did have library rights and voting, and also school. We could vote on school issues. You couldn't necessarily vote for school board, but school issues. As the pace quickens and more states go suffrage and communications improve, there is more at stake. Splits start to occur among the suffragists as to methods and means to the end, and of course that is the vote. Is the best method to work from within established political parties or from a new separate political party? And there was a women's party at one point, and it scared the daylights out of the Republicans and the Democrats and the socialists, because there were socialists around 1900. Should suffrage be reached within each state as the U.S. Constitution allows, or should it come from appealing to Congress and the method of constitutional amendment? And that would still mean ratification by the states. Now, think about it. Are you going to spend all of your energies on the local politicians or on your state legislators and senators? We all know how this goes. And then you're still going to have to go state to state to get the ratification. And you'd need 36 states to ratify at that point. And should the methods of influencing opinion be calm and peaceful? I won't say ladylike, just calm and peaceful, or dramatic and shocking. And that was one of the things that really split the movement. For the last few years, you had certain leaders. One of the major ones was Carrie Chapman Catt. She also has relatives in the state.
In 1916, the National Women's Party was founded. That's the one to which I was referring. In 1917, Jeanette Rankin becomes the first woman in Congress. Because she was from an area that agreed to women's vote, she was able to run for and win the congressional seat.
Other suffragists took their quest in different directions. Alice Paul was another major leader. She was young and college-educated. During World War I, this Quaker and her followers picketed the White House and blamed President Wilson for his refusal to grant women the vote. This stirred controversy. Arrested and sentenced to jail, they were force-fed when they stopped eating. Their hunger strike received widespread publicity, some sympathetic. Inez Milholland was recruited to lead the first large Washington parade. She rode a magnificent horse and at one point had to use it to keep the crowd in line. Troublemakers attacked the floats and marchers, and although the women had been promised protection by President Taft, help never appeared. There was much publicity. Inez Milholland then worked for months for the cause while she was really very ill. Her doctor told her not to appear at a California event. She did speak and collapsed on stage. She died 10 weeks later, a martyr to the cause. Her last public words had been, "Mr. President, how long before women are free?" It became a suffrage motto.
One of the really serious Connecticut founders, and that is Isabella Beecher Hooker, half-sister to the famous author and the famous homemaker, and a real activist. But she started so soon, so early in this, that she's one of the ones who would not speak publicly. Her husband spoke for her. Luckily, he was a very good speaker, a good lawyer, and he wrote up some of the first bills that went through the state legislature that helped women out, having to do mostly with owning property, divorce law, retaining your children after divorce. Here are two of our not so famous sisters, but they were pretty interesting people. They lived in Glastonbury. Julia translated the Bible from Greek, and it was called a woman's Bible. And they owned a farm. They realized that the money that they were paying for taxes was a lot more than some of their men neighbors were paying, so they refused to pay their road tax. And they were arrested. They weren't really arrested. Their land was seized. First they took cows because land was supposed to be by state law the last thing that was taken. But eventually they did lose their land too. And it became a cause célèbre through the area, and they were up in Massachusetts speaking, in New York State, and everywhere. These were the ladies from Connecticut who really started a very active suffrage movement in 1910. When Isabella Hooker sort of lost control, these were the ladies who took over. They were younger, they had energy. Mrs. Mary Rogers of Meriden, Miss Caroline Roots Reese out of Greenwich, Mrs. Catherine Hepburn, Mrs. Hinks of Bridgeport, Mrs. Day of Hartford, who was the next door neighbor of Catherine Hepburn and Dr. Hepburn. And up here we have Emily Pearson of Cromwell, who at the age of 42, when she was all finished with this work, became a doctor. Annie Porritt of Hartford, who was a teacher at Miss Porter's and was a real activist. These were the center of the movement. This is what gave us the vote, this group. I am fond of the men who spoke for suffrage, and one of them was Dr. Thomas Hepburn. I love this statement. When she asked him if her activism would hurt his new medical practice, he said, "Of course it will, but do it anyway." Good for him. A lot was going on with their input, including auto tours by women. Miss Pearson owned her own auto and drove other people around. They had meetings all over the state. They brought in college girls to come and talk to people. If it was an area that was largely French Canadian, they'd get people who spoke French to come in and talk to them. There they are in Pratt Street. They rented space at 5557 Pratt Street in Hartford. Basically specializes in 1915 because according to the state library, they knew they would not get a suffrage vote that year, but they worked for the whole year to influence people.
And they did get a lot of publicity, and they came up with thousands of names on petitions and so forth, and it really worked. But of course, suffrage bill defeated in-house by a vote of 124 to 106, but those numbers aren't bad compared with what they had been before. And the suffrage workers thronged to the Capitol to plead for the ballot, and among others who pleaded for them were men. Union leaders, the AFL president, I think it was AFL, pleaded for them. His name was Stremlau. Women from the various thread factories came in and spoke for them. And just to liven things up, the statue of Nathan Hale, they put a women vote and one sign on one hand and flowers on the other hand. The political setup was not designed for change. Every small town had 2 votes in the legislature. It didn't matter. Farmers and basically the Republican Party had complete control. And it lasted for a long time. Love this. Have you seen this one? She's good enough to be your baby's mother, and she's good enough to vote with you. But isn't that a charming picture? And it looks so modern. The change in style in just 4 or 5 years is quite amazing. And here's Mrs. Hepburn with 4 of her 6 children. She was really quite an amazing person. Not only did she marry a husband who totally understood her, but before she was involved in the suffrage movement, she was involved in the public hygiene movement. It meant trying to teach people about venereal diseases and so forth, and get rid of prostitution. She and her next door neighbor, Mrs. Day, had a very strong movement with the police in Hartford closing down houses of prostitution. They closed down 6 in a very short period of time. This is the Litchfield County group. They went all over Litchfield County. They had a prescribed route. They would advertise in the newspapers. They sent out postcards in advance where they would be the next day. And then when they were finished, they showed movies at the end. I think it was this group, showed movies of what they had done.
What a group with their all dressed up in their Sunday best.
And they hired a driver. This is the Connecticut parades, and we did have a number of them. And they were very well organized. Same people working on Pratt Street. This is from the Museum of Connecticut History. You had the big signs. This is what they would have been carrying. And so you can see the colors, violet and the green. Why each particular group went for the idea of suffrage. College women, we can figure that one out. But the nurses and the social workers had long been appearing at legislative hearings on matters of health and child welfare, particularly. One of the awful things to find out is that right up until the 1930s, they were not recording the orphans, the names and to whom they were given, or where they were placed. And it was in the 1930s that they finally made the rules rigid about that and required that. What a horrifying thought. The factory workers, this would have been the sewing workers in Putnam and Willimantic particularly. A lot of them appeared at hearings with the suffrage women and talked about the problems that they had. They were going for a shorter work week. She's one of the real activists. She had been in England, and the wild women I had mentioned in England, she was strongly influenced by them. She was of the opinion that if they had spent all of this time and all of this effort for all of these years and nothing had moved, you had to start taking other chances. Right. One of her moves was to protest in Washington, and essentially to protest against the president, because it was one person, it was a visibility thing, they would get lots of press, and they did, and therefore they started, and for, was it 3 years? They marched in Washington. When the marching didn't do it, they took stronger action. They picketed the White House. And what you have to realize is that this time period, part of it was during World War I. And there were a lot of people who thought that that was very dumb on their part to do that. And anti-patriotic, unpatriotic, and so forth. So she made some enemies this way. But in the long run, the thing that brought the most fame to the suffrage movement was what happened because of her choice to get arrested. And she would be arrested and let out, and she'd go do the same thing all over again and get arrested again. And finally, they started to get really serious about it, and they put her in a workhouse in Virginia. Edna Purtell started life as a tobacco stripper, making cigars with her parents. At the age of 16, she became secretary of her union. Now that's really something. First of all, she had to be rather smart and was able to read and write and so forth. And that's not that common in those days. And she finally got a job at the Travelers. And Hepburn stopped her and said, "Little Purtell, would you like to go to Washington and, you know, be arrested and demonstrate?" And Purtell answers, "Oh, Mrs. Hepburn, I haven't got any money to go to Washington. I can't afford it. But I have a week's vacation coming from the Travelers." And of course, you can see it coming. Mrs. Hepburn gave her the money. She went to Washington. She was the youngest woman arrested. She also got 2 fingers broken in the arrest. So some of the stories about the nastiness that occurred to them have to be true because she's a living witness. Here we have a map of the people we know from Connecticut and can name who were arrested in Washington and jailed. These were from Hartford. Dr. Dorothy Bartlett was from Putnam, Connecticut. Elise Mary Hill and Helena Hill Weed were from Norwalk. From Bridgeport, Elsie Vervain, Minnie Hennessy, who was self-employed. I love that. She started a group called the Self-Employed Women of Connecticut. And Elsie Vervain led another small group of women who were International Machinists Union, which is kind of hard to fathom, but she did. 4 of them got arrested. And unfortunately, we don't know their names, which is rather sad. The president was a little angry about it, but in actuality, President Wilson was not against the idea of suffrage. It's just that there were so many other things going on, like war and so forth, that he wanted people to just kind of keep it calm, and they weren't willing to by this time. And here, of course, is one of the best cartoons of all time. Now, what happened was, everybody had said, "Mr. Governor Holcomb, you know that this is going to pass. It's already passed in the nation. All of these states are voting for it. Please, couldn't we be one of the ones that makes it possible to ratify?" No, no, no. It never passed. It never passed here. Finally, the state of Tennessee passed it. And then we were going to be like latecomers. But then someone said that Tennessee might not have been legal when they passed it. They may have done some chicanery. And maybe Connecticut has the last chance. So the women gathered everybody. They got people in from 48 states, and they did a whole week of visiting the governor's office. And it didn't work. It didn't work. Finally, he had to call a meeting for the legislature. He had to call the legislature back into session and ask them to, he didn't want to ratify. It was too late now. It didn't matter anymore. What he wanted was women voters who could actually vote Republican. It's now 1920, and women have the vote all over the nation. Thank goodness. And this beautiful, beautiful poster was the cover of the Woman's Journal, founded 1870, the same one we saw on the other side. This was their patriotic joy in women's suffrage. Suffrage won, forward march. The 1920s come, suffrage is here. Carrie Chapman Catt has already made arrangements, groups that had worked for suffrage, to form leagues. And they'd already decided that they would be nonpartisan. But they did have one big argument, and that was against Senator Brandegee. He was anathema to them. He's the only person that they ever worked against politically, because he had essentially promised them he would do one thing and then had done another. You get the idea. So they revved up all of the facilities that they had had going during suffrage period and worked against him. The cars are getting cuter. This is owned by the State League. The first 2 leagues that really took action were New Haven, and the minutes of their first meeting, the Hartford League of Women Voters, was Mrs. Hiram Percy Maxim, the first woman elected as a representative to the Democratic Convention. We found a check for the membership payment to the League of Women Voters of Hartford from Beatrice Fox Orbach.
This is Catherine Luddington from Old Lyme. When the suffrage movement was on, she had her chauffeur drive her from Old Lyme every day up to Pratt Street. And she worked long hours, and then he'd drive her back home to Old Lyme. This is Mary Townsend Seymour. I'm not sure she was a League member, I doubt it actually, but she was a real activist in suffrage movement. And she's one of those who brought the NAACP into Hartford and also got all kinds of activities with other organizations involved. Alice Hamilton is really interesting. She started in chemistry and then ended up the first woman on the faculty of Harvard, full faculty of Harvard. And as she put it, they had to give me the professorship. I was the only one in the field. Because what she did was industrial chemistry and industrial health. She went all over the country as an advisor on what you couldn't do in coal mines, what you couldn't do in chemical factories, how you had to have, they didn't call them scrubbers in those days, but you get the same idea. And she lived in Connecticut. She came back to Connecticut because she's another one, had been to Miss Porter's and came back to live. She and her sister was Edith Hamilton, the one who wrote the great mythologies. What a family. The 1930s, well, everything was wrong in the 1930s. Except for the League, of course, they were doing well. And we meet another really interesting person, Mrs. Dodurian, who was another one of our members, a Greater Hartford member at the later part in her life. But she was also a Hartford member, the president of the State League, on the national board, and I don't know how she found the time to do it. She was a social worker full-time. She, during the 1930s, worked for the National Recovery Act. She ran programs out of Hartford teaching women how to use sewing machines. They were paid a certain amount. They had the material supplied to them. They were taught to run the machines. And then afterwards they had a skill that they could market. This is a note journal where she says how much good it did for them, particularly the women with children. And I love it. So you've got the state, you've got the National Recovery Act and the local response to it. Finally, women got to serve on juries, a 16-year struggle. The governor signs it. A lot of League women, a number of the old suffragists spoke as well. And in Greenwich, a meeting was held to explain the proposed representative form of government. That's for the town. They ended up having town meetings in Greenwich rather than running it another way. And they broke into small districts all over the whole town. Very active in publicizing birth control. It had been illegal to publicize this kind of information. And of course that doesn't change until the law case of 65. But she's the saint of married women. Catherine Rohrbach, she's of the Litchfield-Rohrbach family. Her big field is civil rights. She made it part of her practice to protect the legal rights of dissenters and the dispossessed. 1940s, again dominated by World War II. There's a wonderful irony. The women were studying Japan. They were planning a big meeting on December 11, 1941, to study relations with Japan. They sold war bonds as they did in World War I. They trained, they had women who were created broad. They just did all kinds of work helping the government get through the disaster. And towards the end of it, they were involved in planning for after the war. The state had a poll out finding out people's attitudes towards isolationism after World War II. 30,000 people in the state were questioned, and every single local league took part in it. The 1950s were rather an odd time. One of the biggest influences was Senator Joe McCarthy. He caused a great deal of difficulty for liberals particularly who disagreed with his idea that communism was rampant everywhere. The League of Women Voters nationally decided that one way to combat his activity was to concentrate on the real meaning of the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights. They did, but to quote her, they were stopped in places in Texas by gun. The president was fond of the League of Women Voters. Eisenhower spoke a major foreign policy statement to the National Convention for the League, which was in Washington at that point.
Local materials were still happening. A voting notebook out in Manchester and in Milford covering the referenda. There was so much rapid change and turmoil in the 1960s. Assassinations, riots, and social upheaval made it difficult to live in everyday life. But youth, women, and minorities were finding a voice, and the League responded. League goals set decades before, such as women's rights and legal protection, and voting rights for all, were now close. I think it's a wonderful piece of art. And the names of the women who did it are on the back, and the colors are so then.
Reminiscent of the time.
Oh, they certainly are. Locally, things are happening as usual. Down in the southern part of the state, the women were asking that a marina not be built. In New Britain, the League started up again. It had been gone, dead for about 10 years. And the ERA, this is pretty funny, don't let Big Sister bait you. Don't let the Equal Rights Amendment become part of the Constitution, because it's the League of Women Voters baiting you. And it did go before the state voters. Yeah, we passed it, but it died because it lacked 3 states. Kathy Golas, specialist in waste management, when the idea of the bottle bill came about, she's the one who figured out how they were going to work it. They had leaguers getting all the information on the waste stream in different towns, and what would happen if 15% of the waste was in bottles, what would it save each town in their waste stream if they could remove those bottles? Then she won a $21,000 grant, and it was the League who sponsored her. The elected state board of the League has a very active schedule, informing members of legislative activities and providing alerts on problems or concerns. In the reverse, new ideas and new issues may come from locals, perk up a bit online or at committee meetings, and then be voted on as policy or program at the annual state conventions. Then these positions are followed through with dogged daily work by our specialists, whose job it is to follow bills and inform the legislators. The Campaign Finance Reform Bill is one of these. Governor Rell is flanked here by our current state president, Cheryl Dunson, and Christine Horrigan, legislative specialist. Both have worked on this bill since 2004. It offers public financing for political campaigns. The League of Women Voters was also active in calling for the new electronic voting equipment. We have registered new voters and published information on the voting process as the suffragists did in 1920. Most of our locals offer materials on the candidates running for election. Sometimes this is done in print and often on the local's website. Many town leagues sponsor campaign debates, such as public access television. The State League has traditionally handled United States Senate and House debates. We train moderators, so if other organizations need an unbiased moderator, we are at your service. You may have seen our group at the Hartford Capitol giving tours of the facility. Hundreds of people are escorted through the legislature and offices yearly. One recent group they handled was from Russia. They're guests of the Canton, Connecticut League, staying in local homes for a week. All are involved in court work. It turns out that only 3 organizations in this whole country are approved to host people in the Open World Leadership Program of the Library of Congress. The League of Women Voters is one of those 3. I'd like to think that a suffragist from 1915 would recognize the League meaning of today if she walked in on one. The exact topics might differ, but the goals and energy would be the same. We would all be working to create active, informed citizens and to foster a government that would serve them well. We are marching in their footsteps. Hard work's all done. Now we can relax, and it's awfully nice to see you ladies. We started with your work, which was print manager, and you had so much to do.
But it was fun. It was a challenge, and I enjoyed doing it.
Oh, good. Thank you.
You know, and then when I saw the exhibit, I was really delighted.
I think I heard from you that the show is going on the road.
The program itself, all of that work on suffrage and Connecticut suffrage, which is the original research, is going out to museums and libraries and leagues over the next 2 years.